Welcome to the Mind Solution podcast with Sarah Maud. The Mind Solution podcast is for leaders like you who are passionate about well-being in the workplace because you understand that a strong, resilient and happy workforce is the key to your organisation's success. The Mind Solution podcast is here to help you. So join us every week where we'll share with you powerful insights, strategies and know-how to ensure that your people and your organisation are truly thriving from the inside out. So welcome to another episode of the Mind Solution International podcast, and I'm delighted to be joined by the sixth most influential practitioner in the UK for 2022 as voted by HR magazine, Nebel Crowhurst. I feel like we need a fanfare for you, Nebel.
That was a lovely intro. Thanks, Sarah.
So, Nebel, I know that you've got so much experience when it comes to HR, and you're also a non-executive director for Macmillan Cancer Support. But as we spoke about before we hit the record button, that a big passion of yours is about diversity and inclusion and that feeling of belonging. So I'd love you to just share with our listeners a little bit about your background and what it is that you were doing that got you such a prestigious award.
Sure. So, I always think that I've been very fortunate in that I've worked in some really fantastic organisations and been able to be part of some brilliant cultures and work alongside outstanding people. And I guess from a HR perspective, that really started many years ago working as part of the Virgin family and really being in an environment that absolutely embraced individuality and people to really show up and be themselves. And I think that's continued through the businesses that I've worked in. And to me, it's so important that people can show up, have their voice, be their true authentic selves so that they do have that sense of belonging in the workplace. Because without that, I think workplaces would be quite dull. We need difference, we need uniqueness, we need difference in viewpoints to generate innovation, to generate new ideas. And I think it's only in recent years that businesses have really felt and recognised the importance of really focusing on then having rounded D&I strategies that help to enable encouraging people to feel like they truly belong, that they can be their true authentic selves. So I've worked in some great businesses, Virgin being one. I moved on from there to work in a fantastic fashion retailer, which most people will be familiar with, which is River Island, and then worked in a pharma organisation, which again, very different, but also had a huge emphasis on diversity and inclusion. And continue to focus in that space because I recognise the importance. And like you say, also just recently starting to do some work with Macmillan and the great things that they do. So I've been very fortunate in the places that I've worked during my career.
Absolutely. It's an amazing testament to you. And what I really liked about what you said, Nebel, is about having that authenticity and a voice, because I think sometimes when it comes to diversity and inclusion, we might think about that in terms of sexuality, gender, race, religion, but actually I love it about it's about our voice and our voice being heard and recognized. Because like you, in my HR career, I worked for some amazing organizations, but I felt a lot of the time that people were wearing masks and that they weren't just being their authentic self. And I'd love to know your thoughts about what do you believe an organization needs to be doing to actively allow people to feel safe to be authentic?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that point around feeling safe is also really important. And I know it's something that has been probably spoken about more recently in this context of psychological safety within organisations. But I think that's a really important aspect to enable people to feel comfortable to share their voice. I think businesses have got a responsibility, and HR functions, leadership teams, however, you want to position it, but to find different mechanisms to enable people to share their voice in a way that feels most comfortable for them. So for some people, they might be very comfortable in an open forum to have a discussion, to share their views, to share their own stories, their own lived experiences. For other people, they might find that a bit overwhelming, and so they might want to do something in a quieter way. But it's about finding those different mechanisms to encourage that sharing of stories, sharing of experiences, because the beauty of that then is people can also learn. I think it's all fine and well encouraging voice in a business, that's wonderful, and appreciating other people's perspectives and their lived experiences, but by doing so we each learn. I've been very lucky to work with people through D&I strategies, and I've learned loads. People have an expectation that you're in a HR role, so you know everything about everything and every different type of person. And whilst I'd love to, I'm only one human being, and I've only had my own lived experiences. And so the more you open your ears to listen to what people have gone through in their life stories, the more you can appreciate and learn and understand the difference that people's experiences have taken them through their life's careers. So that there's two aspects to it. There is the employee voice, but then it's about how do you listen? How do you listen and learn? And what do you do with that knowledge to help drive better cultures within organisations?
Yeah, and it's so fascinating that you said that, because I literally was speaking to a huge national organisation this morning that recognised that they did lots of employee surveys and engagement surveys, but they didn't really listen to what was coming out of that in terms of the data, and then weren't using that data, which to me is gold dust, in actually, well, what do we do to make this a better environment, an environment where people want to come to work, that enjoy what they do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that has been a bit of an age-old problem with gathering information and doing things like engagement surveys that historically, and maybe some businesses still do this, but you would tend to do once a year. You'd then be overloaded with information all at the same time. It would take them months to trawl through it, to then create action plans to demonstrate to people that you're actually moving forwards with what they've shared. Most often now, what we're seeing is organisations that want to hear people's inputs and employee voice much more regularly. So pulse checks and regular engagement itself enables businesses, and it enables leaders to put into practice tangible action much more swiftly than listening only once a year. And I think the engagement survey is one thing, but then how else can you solicit information, data, insights to understand truly what's going on across a business? One of the things that worked really well, that personally I took a lot from and also enjoyed, specifically at Roche, was a reverse mentoring program that we had set up for us. So we had a fantastic D&I ERG set up across the business, and one of the ideas that one of the team came up with was reverse mentoring, so matching members of the leadership team with somebody who has a very different makeup, a different background, a different completely different perspective on life, and then having a series of conversations to truly understand what their lived experience in the organisation is versus what mine was, and what I as a leader could then learn to be able to implement and do things differently. So that was a one-on-one experience, whereas an engagement survey is listening to an entire organisation. And I think it's about everything in between: group interactions, small check-ins with people, one-to-one conversations, and of course the overall engagement survey, so you can get that full perspective.
Absolutely. I love that idea. That's a wonderful idea. And what I also love about that is, do you think it's reasonable to say that when it comes to an engagement survey, that the survey results can also be impacted based on how somebody's state of mind is that day? So if they've just had, say, for example, a conversation with their manager and they've felt very frustrated, maybe they're feeling like their manager's not really listening, not really hearing them in that conversation, that's what's going to come out when they fill out the survey, compared to maybe a different day when things are just going well, they're feeling really good. So to just use one measurement of how an organization's feeling, the data can perhaps be a little bit skewed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a moment in time. Whenever you fill out something like that, it's a moment in time. And I think that's why it's so important to move away from the yearly approach, and perhaps have a blend of smaller bite-sized surveys, but then also pulse checks, just temperature checks. What's the general sense, and mood across the business? But specifically with D&I, an engagement survey will give you so much. There's probably questions in there about, do you feel that the organisation takes D&I seriously, those kind of things. What you're not going to get from an engagement survey is true insight around, what is the kind of makeup of the organisation. What is your gender balance? What is your ethnicity balance? What are your pay gaps? Those kind of things. And so organisations that are being much more focused and progressive in this particular space are being proactive with looking at far more in-depth data around D&I, so that they can really understand where they've got to focus their efforts with their D&I strategies to make improvements across the organisation in terms of diversity. That's not an easy job. It's quite a big task, but it's one that really makes a difference to the culture of the business.
Yeah. And what are maybe, obviously in confidence, but what are maybe some of the success stories and victories that you can share based on the work that you have done and where you've seen it make a real impact?
Yeah, I think the work that you do when you set up frameworks that enable people to feel like they can have their voice, they can come to work feeling authentically, they can contribute ideas and suggestions around how we can improve the culture of the business, really make a big difference. And I suppose you do then see that in turn in the general results of engagement surveys, because you will see that the overall, sense of people's, pride and advocacy in the business will start to improve. And again, I go back to Roche purely because, there was, we had a really well established approach there, but we'd made a conscious decision to really focus on, like I said before, gathering the insights and data and understanding what we're doing well and what we're not doing so well, so that we can really make a difference. I think it's a brave organisation that's happy to say, okay, what do we need to do to find out what we're not doing so well and face into that. It can feel uncomfortable. It can feel quite challenging. It can feel disappointing, because you can sometimes sit and think, oh, we're doing a really fantastic job here. And then you gather the insight and you work through that and you think, oh, actually, no, there's an area here that we really needed to have done. And we partnered with Chorus Executive, Frank and Jen, who are absolutely awesome in this space, and people that I would encourage people to follow. But they really supported us in helping to shape what our strategy looked like, so that we could really have an emphasis on the things that were going to make the biggest difference to our people.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we talk about vulnerability in the workplace, and just in the same way that we need to encourage that vulnerability. What I'm hearing there is that an organization needs to make itself vulnerable for those exact reasons, that
Yeah.
you're willing to really listen and take on board, because as you say, that can be quite an uncomfortable experience if you are getting feedback that you weren't expecting and is maybe a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah, that's a really good way of framing it. Absolutely. It is about the organisation feeling, putting themselves in a position of vulnerability. But sometimes, I feel sometimes you have to go through the pain to be able to move forward, whether that's D&I or anything else that you're working on. Unless you really deep dive into something, how do you truly know whether you're doing a good job or not? And I mean, even at an individual level, that's about being self-aware, that's about gathering feedback, that's about being open to knowing where your blind spots are and the things that you need to improve. If you bury your head in the sand, how can you move forward? And same with a business. If you bury your head in the sand and convince yourself everything's perfect and everyone's skipping through hoops because they're, delighted to, be at work every day and everything's absolutely perfect, well, it's rose tinted glasses. It's not a reality. You're never going to get it perfect all the time, but you need to be able to be comfortable in being uncomfortable and hearing some of the stuff that can be quite difficult to hear, but doing something about it and truly listening to it is what's important.
And I guess any form of change, whether that's organizational change, leadership change, cultural change, personal change is uncomfortable. If it
Yeah,
wasn't uncomfortable, then we wouldn't be changing because
yeah,
we're stepping out of what's familiar into something that's maybe unfamiliar or unknown. And as human beings, we don't like what's unknown. It does feel a bit sticky. So
yeah,
I would almost kind of advocate that if it feels uncomfortable, you're actually in the right space.
yeah, yeah.
Now, from a leadership perspective, Nebel, where do you see leaders playing a key part in authenticity, diversity, and inclusion? Because I had a conversation with an HR specialist this morning, and it was a really interesting conversation because she was sharing something about her manager. And she said, I don't feel listened to, I don't feel heard, I don't feel like I belong. And there might be a great organization, I won't name them here, but we were talking about how people don't leave organizations unless they've just outgrown the position and they're looking for a new challenge. But in the main, they leave a manager.
Mm.
And so for me, there's a huge piece of work around the managers, and not just in terms of awareness, because we can know something on an intellectual level, but it doesn't mean we're embodying it. So where do you see the leaders playing a big role in embodying this strategy?
Yeah, so leaders absolutely need to be role models. Leaders don't necessarily, like I've just said before, don't have to always know the answers and should feel comfortable to say, actually, I'm not sure about this. Where can I go and find that out? And again, that comes back down to this vulnerability piece. But for me, the thing that makes the biggest difference is leaders that are emotionally aware, so emotionally intelligent leaders. I'm a huge fan understanding what EQ means in terms of leadership capability. It's something that I have focused on for many years, and decided to become an EQ practitioner so that I could support and work with leaders across businesses to help grow their own emotional intelligence and also their self-awareness around it. And that tends to be the biggest struggle. If somebody has got lacking self-awareness, they are not at all realizing the impact that they have on the people around them. So that example that you've just given about that person you were talking to, that manager won't be intentionally making that person feel that way. I tend to come from a place of always thinking that people come from a good direction, that people aren't going out of their way to make people feel unhappy. But if they're not particularly self-aware and they haven't developed their emotional intelligence skills, they can be very much lacking in terms of management and leadership capability. I think what's great about EQ, though, is that we can grow that skill, we can develop it, we can self-assess, we can gather feedback and recognize where those pitfalls are, and put in place new behaviors, learned behaviors, ways in which we can adapt our style. We don't change who we are innately, we are who we are, and that's great, but we can become more self-aware to know that if I react in this way, what it means to the person on the receiving end and how they feel, what impact does that have on them, and how might I be able to adapt my reactions, my behaviors to make the people around me feel more comfortable, more included, have that greater sense of belonging. So I think it all joins together.
100%. And I really loved what you said there, Nabel, about that level of self-awareness, because we can have the most intelligent leaders in the world, but if they don't know how to regulate their emotions, if
Yeah.
they don't know how to manage their emotional responses, because we're human, we have human wobbles. That's what makes us human and not robots. But a big part for me in leaders and in the workforce as a whole is really being able to understand what's creating our experience at any given moment. And there's so much of a misunderstanding about where our experiences are coming from. So it's like if you're, say, for example, you're upset and you're looking outside of yourself and going, well, I feel upset because of that person, or because of that change at work, or because of this initiative, or because of this, that, and the other. So it's that kind of brain doing the associating about why I feel the way that I feel. And yet when we really get into the emotions and the psychology of emotion, is helping people to understand that they're creating their emotional experiences. And
Yeah.
working with leaders, that can be really uncomfortable because they've got nothing to blame anymore. They have to go, oh, I'm responsible for the emotions that I'm creating at any given moment.
Yeah.
But when they do start to realize it, the clarity that comes from that is just wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I've seen so many shifts in leaders in terms of how they lead their people, how they communicate, how they enable people to feel empowered in the work that they do, simply by being open enough to be able to look at EQ, um, you know, peel back the layers a little bit, be a bit uncomfortable, and say, okay, I'm not the finished article. What do I need to improve? It's the area that I've seen the biggest shifts, real powerful shifts in people in terms of their leadership capability and their style and how they interact with people in their teams.
Totally. And I know from my own experience of working in HR, I saw so many organizations that would plow thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds into leadership courses that could be, anything from a day to literally a week, but they didn't fundamentally change how that person showed up because the underlying structures that were creating those emotional responses hadn't shifted.
Yeah.
So it kind of comes back to that. We can teach people about leadership from an intellectual level, but how do we embody that emotional, not intelligence, but for me, it's about that, their ability to know who they are.
Yeah.
And so I love the fact that you're absolutely an advocate for that, because I think that before anything else is the key piece of the jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, you're spot on, because you're right. When you think about leadership programs, and I'm sure people will have had their own experiences of attending these types of things, but you're right, from an intellectual perspective, you can go on a program and you can learn about theories and principles and all those kind of things, and they're lovely, and you can in a practical sense understand and appreciate what they mean. But how you then apply that, and how you apply it to yourself in an authentic way, because how somebody applies one thing compared to how somebody else might do it may also be different, is where the big shifts happen. So it is much more at an individualistic level, and really appreciating each person's strengths, areas of focus and things that they need to build on, rather than just sheep dipping people through programs of a series of different models and principles. And there are lots of models and principles I love, right? There's loads, and that I absolutely buy into, but unless you know how to apply those to yourself, then it's kind of just interesting rather than it being impactful.
No, I'm completely with you. And it's one of the reasons that when I see an awful lot of organizations investing in psychometrics, I see that, again, it's interesting. So I know for myself, when I worked in HR, I did DISC.
Yeah.
You familiar with DISC?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for people that are not, there's basically 4 archetypes, where you have dominant, influencing, supportive, and actually, I can't even remember what the C was. Can you remember what the C was?
It's not one I've done lots of work on. I know of it, but yeah, I've used different tools. Yeah.
Go collaborate. Yeah, can't remember. Google it, people. Google it. And it would have kind of what's your most dominant style
Yeah.
under certain situations. Well, when I first did it, I was off the scale for dominant. And I recognized that. I did recognize that. And that when I got under pressure, I'd be like, right, what is it that we need to do, instead of kind of influencing. So when I got the scores, a bit like you said, it was like, okay, well, I was a leader. I had a team of HR people under me. Like, okay, that's really interesting. But how do I change that? So if it's not backed up with one-to-one coaching or even group coaching, then it's kind of, it doesn't really fulfill much of a purpose. Do you agree?
Yeah, agreed. And the coaching piece is really key, because that's where you can then really delve into things and actually work through, if you've got something that's been highlighted to you, what do you need to do then to put into practice different behaviours, different ways of doing things. But I think it's also still worth noting, whilst I'm saying, you know, we need to adapt our style, that's not to say that I believe people need to fundamentally change who they are. We are who we are, and that's great. But it's about recognizing how our reactions and responses impact others and how we can adapt ourselves to enable people more effectively. So I think that's something that sometimes people find a little bit difficult, because you enter into a dialogue around, you know, where you need to improve as a leader, and at the same time we're encouraging people to be authentic leaders, and it kind of sounds at face value counterintuitive, but actually it's about that self-awareness piece and knowing how you impact those around you.
No, I agree with you, Nebel. And actually, the word that often comes up for me is about acceptance, because I think as part of that self-awareness piece, a lot of people are often carrying quite core beliefs about themselves, about their self-worth, about feeling good enough. You know, the term, like, for example, imposter syndrome. And so they're living in their own sort of miniature virtual realities,
Yeah.
which is what's projecting their experiences. So I'm with you. This isn't about saying, right, you need to change in order to be perfect. It's like, actually, let's start by accepting who we are and recognizing that we're already whole and complete as we are, but that sometimes our behaviors maybe just aren't serving us and serving the people that we lead.
Yes, that's a lovely way of putting it.
And when it comes to the whole D&I piece, where do you see that feeding into well-being and a well-being strategy? Because I think sometimes when I speak to organizations, they're a little bit overloaded, going, right, okay, we've got to do stuff around D&I, we've got to do stuff around mental health, we've got to do stuff around well-being, leadership, and it's like, poof.
Yeah, I actually see them as being intrinsically linked. So I think often what you find is you might have your kind of overarching people strategy, and then you have a separate D&I strategy, and then you have a separate wellbeing strategy, and, you know, all your other sort of talent acquisition, all those kind of things. But actually, where I think you can work smarter is linking together the fact that if people have that true sense of belonging in an organization, that feeds their well-being. So I see that those two things should be joined together. You know, I think at face value, what happens is with wellbeing strategies, it's a case of, oh, okay, so we'll run a you know, mental health first aider course, and we'll do a little bit of yoga on videos for people at lunchtime, and, you know, we'll signpost people to things, and that's lovely and all really important stuff that needs to happen. But so what? You know, what does that really mean in terms of organizational impact? What does that truly mean to employees in terms of how they feel in the way in which they can you know, build their resilience and grow and develop within the organization? So I think actually, if you can work really smart and have those two things connected to one another rather than having them as separate initiatives, I think it can have even greater impact across the business. But the undertone to that for me is about the belonging piece. I think that's what's really important. You know, I think at a core level, as human beings, we've got this kind of need to feel like we're connected, we belong, we feel part of something. It's that tribal type thing, isn't it? You know, that sense of being part of a tribe. And so that's why belonging is so important. You know, we want to go to work and feel like we're part of something. We don't want to feel like an outsider. And so all of that feeds our overall well-being, our overall sense of balance, and how we are as a person in terms of strength and resilience.
Totally. And it's really interesting about the whole piece about belonging, and use that beautiful word connection. Because I guess if we were going to go slightly off the radar here, the fact that we are all connected at that energetic level. Now, whether people believe that or not, I could give you a whole science lesson on quantum physics and quantum mechanics that can prove that we are all connected at that energetic level. And that's where I see the whole self-awareness piece at all levels of an organization being so pivotal, because if we don't feel that we belong, it might not be that the organization's doing anything wrong per se, But if we think about the role of the ego wants to keep us separate. The ego feeds off fear. It's like ego and fear are like brothers. And actually, that's what creates that perception of separate realities, if that makes sense. I might be going a little bit deep on the psychological side of things. So an organization could be doing some amazing things, but at that fundamental, I suppose you could say spiritual level, if we don't have that self-awareness of the truth of who we really are, then that's going to create that sense of separation. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, and you know, I do buy into the piece around all being connected at a kind of energetic level. I'm no expert in quantum physics, but it's something I'm aware of. But it'll certainly be an area of more expertise for you. But I think at a more easily digestible way of looking at it is people's core values, right? So we probably can all understand and articulate our own personal core values, and most organizations have got their values. And if you can find a connection point there that feels like your values and the organizational values complement one another, that's a good starting point. That's the kind of, I suppose, more workplace example that you could give around, you know, energetic connection is the piece around our own values. So and therein lies another important aspect to how an organizational culture is articulated. You know, I would say most businesses do articulate their values, their mission, their purpose, those kind of things. As an employee, you can choose to work within an organization where that mission, purpose, those values resonate with you, make sense to you, that you feel like you can buy into, you can contribute to, and you can connect to. But that in itself, that's all part of the piece around belonging. If you work in an organization where your values are at odds with how a company works, whether that be from a values point of view, whether that be around their integrity, those kind of things, or that their sense of purpose doesn't marry up with what you're trying to achieve in terms of your own sense of purpose, that will create friction, and that will mean that someone doesn't feel like they belong, someone doesn't feel like they fit into that particular environment. And so there's either a choice around the business adapting or the individual adapting, or just saying, do you know what, this isn't a perfect match, and so actually I'd step away and find somewhere that works better, that fits with my values, my passion, my purpose, those kind of things. So I think there's that undertone as well that needs to feel joined up for people to feel that sense of belonging, connectedness.
Yes. And I think it's really important that people recognize within themselves what do they value, and kind of almost when they're looking for job roles, kind of what are their 3 top values? Because I know myself, I was very clear about my values, and there was one organization that I worked for that it just wasn't the right fit. And it was only actually after I left that I thought, oh, actually, when I reflected on it, their values just didn't match my values.
Yeah.
But my key value is about freedom. So that freedom of speech, freedom to be authentic, freedom to, well, it's probably why I ended up running my own company so that I'd be free to do what I want and work how I want, to the best extent anyway. And I think that's such an important piece, because I know from my HR days, we would often see values on the company wall, but it wasn't integrated into their D&I strategy, or equality and diversity, as we called it back then. I'm showing my age now. But they weren't living the values. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I think you can have examples where organizations have got, you know, a lovely set of words and a few icons that go with it, and it doesn't you know, do a great deal other than looking pretty on the wall. Exactly correct. So, you know, if you really want to bring to life your values across an organization, they do need to be entwined in everything. They need to be entwined in your recognition program. They need to be entwined in your D&I strategy. They need to be entwined in how you recruit people, what your employer branding looks like. Every aspect of your culture and your people strategy need to reflect what the organizational values are, as well as the purpose and the mission of the business. So, you know, without that, I think businesses will probably spend an awful lot of money creating a lovely set of phrases or words, and then, you know, nothing really happens with it. So it's a bit of a shame and a waste of money not to do that and not to really bring it to life. It fills me with joy when you see organizations that truly do live and breathe their values and truly do come together in a unified way to go after their mission and their purpose. You know, that's a brilliant environment to be working in for anybody. And you know, whenever I see examples of it when I'm speaking to colleagues and peers across the HR industry, it's wonderful to see.
Now, for some organisations where maybe they're not larger organisations and don't have huge budgets, and they might be, you know, listening to this, they could be, say, for example, startups or just smaller organisations, and they're listening and they're thinking, okay, this sounds like having a D&I strategy would be of real value to our organisation for all the reasons that you've said, but they're not really sure where to start. Because I guess if we think about the term D&I, like it's like the term mental health, it covers such a huge spectrum. What would your advice be, Nebel, about actually where can an organisation start?
Yeah, I think to start with, go out and speak to people, like we've said. So we talked before about gathering insights, but I think first of all, be clear on where you want to focus, because you may have some areas that don't require as much focus as others. So don't try and fix everything all at the same time, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Take off bite-sized chunks. So if you know that within your organization, you absolutely have a requirement or a gap or something where you need to focus on gender balance, for example, then prioritize that to start with. So work out where your areas of D&I are most lacking that you need to think about. And you can really do that by speaking to people across the business. And you don't need money to do that. You just need a bit of time. You need to set up mechanisms to encourage gathering that information. The second thing is having very clear leadership sponsorship, because I see with D&I, you need it to come from two angles. It's very much something that can be employee-led, which is brilliant, and I would embrace that. But if it's employee-led without leadership sponsorship, it can fall down. So I think it's really important that you've got that key sponsorship in the business that demonstrates that leaders in the business recognise the value in spending time, effort, and energy on D&I. And then the third thing I would say is establish some employee groups, so ERGs, employee resource groups, where you've got passionate people across the business that want to be able to contribute to supporting the D&I agenda, so that you've got that employee-led angle, and just start small. You know, start thinking about some of the small things that you can do to make the biggest difference. And gradually build up and shape what your overall strategy looks like, maybe for the next year or so. And then, you know, if you want to build it out further into the next 3 years, that's great. But I think if you don't have much budget, you're a small organization, it goes back to gathering information where you can from your people, making sure you've got clear leadership sponsorship, and then understanding where you've got passionate people in the organization to be part of D&I networks or ERG groups, those kind of things, and build it up over a period of time.
Well, that sounds wonderful advice. And my last question, although I could talk to you all day, Nebel, is, as somebody that's such a high-ranking HR influencer, where do you see the focus for HR professionals over the next couple of years really needing to be? Because HR, you know, they've had quite a rocky ride over the last few years responding to the pandemic. We've got mental health that is more at the forefront than any other time that it's ever been. We've got this awareness of D&I. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts about kind of the future of HR as you see it.
That's a big question. That's a whole different podcast. I think some of it we've started to really work on. So whilst so my view is always, from a HR point of view, we have to get our core fundamentals in order, right? So we have to just make sure our hygiene factors are sorted, you know, pay people, make sure we're legal and compliant. That stuff's really important. You then overlay that with a focus on employee experience, and the way in which people feel when they come to work, which is a lot of what we've just talked about today. but we also need to continue to stay very strategic and commercial in organisations. And I think what the last couple of years has done for HR through COVID is help businesses to see how important HR is to thrive and drive businesses forward. So you've kind of got those three buckets of, your core fundamentals, overall employee experience and how people feel, but also the commerciality and the strategic viewpoint. If you focus on those three things, the other elements come as part of it. So all the debate and discussion at the moment about hybrid working, all of the challenges that we're facing right now about cost of living crisis, all of those things, to me, that comes under the umbrella of overall employee experience. If we can get that right, that then feeds into commercial success of the business, because the more engaged your people are across the business, the better you are at retaining your great talent across the business. Those things contribute to the stability and the strength of your organization, and in turn makes the business more able to achieve its its strategic goals or its financial goals, whatever is set out. So I think it's threefold. I don't think that's groundbreakingly different to anything we should have been doing historically. But whether all HR leaders, all HR functions are focusing on all three of those areas is probably questionable. And I suppose it's important that regularly we take stock and we reflect and we challenge ourselves and really question, are we getting the foundations right? Is that running smoothly? Are we making sure we focus on employee experience? And are we continuing to be really commercial and focusing on the overall organisational strategy?
Wonderful. And I loved what you said there about the strategic and commercial piece. And for anybody that's listening in, I would invite you to hop onto the podcast that I did with David Blackburn, who was the third most influential HR practitioner. You're in the top 10, Nebel.
I'm happy with that.
Where David gives a
good company.
wonderful insight into making well-being strategic for all of the reasons that you shared there, Nebel. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a wonderful space to just explore your thoughts and to listen to your insight and your expertise. It's very clear why you've won your award, and I'm wishing you very best of luck for the future. If you want to stay on for the moment, thank you for everybody that's tuned in to this podcast. If you've got any comments, then do drop us a line at info@themind solution. But for now, we look forward to speaking to you again soon.